So welcome everyone. We're really excited to be working on this class. My name is Jill Montague. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Montclair Film. And Montclair Film is thrilled to be partnering with Mill to be putting on the class and the discussions about these films over the next few weeks. And we're grateful that you signed up and are able to participate and join us in these conversations. Ken has picked out, our moderator has picked out some great films for us to talk about. There's a lot of meaty discussions there, so we're gonna get right into it. But really quick, just a couple of quick Zoom guidelines. And I know that a lot of you guys have been doing the Zoom thing for a while now, so you probably are pretty familiar with this, but just in case, you probably want to click on speaker view. If you look, I think for most of you who are on a laptop, it's in the upper right-hand corner. If you kind of scroll up, you'll see either little boxes or it'll say speaker view or gallery view. For this discussion, it's probably best to keep it on speaker view so that you can focus in on whoever is speaking. So it's going to be Ken, and then we're going to kind of have some conversation, which is going to be great. Also, if your the name on your Zoom screen doesn't match what you like to be called, for instance, just looking over at our participants, there's a couple of people who it's your phone number or it's a something that may not be what you want to be called. If you're participating in the conversation, you can hover over your Zoom image and click on the three dots and then choose rename and type your name into the box. And then that way, we know who we're talking to as we go through the conversation. So we are going to try to, if you all could keep yourselves on mute unless you have a question or a contribution to the discussion, that would be great. That just helps us to minimize any background noise and makes it easier for everyone to hear the speaker. And then when you want to participate in the conversation, you can either use the raise your hand feature, which if you don't know where that is, I think it's on the bottom where it says more. In the participants section, you can raise your hand or you can type your question into the chat box and we'll make sure to address your question. Don't forget to unmute your microphone before you start speaking. And if you have any technical questions or just questions in general while the conversation is going on, you can always send me something in the chat box and I'll make sure to address that off to the side, and that way it doesn't interrupt the flow of the conversation. So without further ado, I want to introduce Ken Ronkowitz, who is going to be our facilitator for the discussion. Ken is a lifelong educator, and we're thrilled. He works with us on our Cinema and Conversation matinee series at Montclair Film when we're able to be in the theater. And so we're thrilled that he's going to be talking with us today about Jim and Andy. Ken.
Come on. Hello. Clap. Another thing we can do is at the bottom of your screen, if you're on a laptop, there's the reactions thing. And you can do the hand clap, or if I ask a question, you can give a thumbs up if you want to give a thumbs up. And I'm going to ask a question to begin with, which is, has anyone that's attending today attended our Cinema and Conversation series live at Montclair Film? Is there anybody who's done that? I'm looking at the gallery view here to see if I see some thumbs up, a couple thumbs up. I mean, we're trying to duplicate that idea of watching a film and then after the film having a conversation. And I'm going to do basically the same thing, which is have a little intro, which we did via the handout that you got. Hopefully everybody got that and had a chance to look at it, and give a couple of questions that you can think about when you're watching the film. We'll start with those, but we don't have to stick to those kind of thing. And the three films that we have this month all have to do with sort of getting behind the scenes on a film. This one, I guess performance and acting is the focus of it, although there's some other things. You might identify with Milos Forman at some point and his frustration with being the director Man on the Moon kind of thing. So just a little bit from the introduction, and that, you know, people can comment at any time. You can unmute yourself if you want to say something, and you should pop up on there. But I don't know what your first introduction to Andy Kaufman was. I had a really strange one. I think it actually is his first appearance on television. My mother was a big fan of Merv Griffin. Remember the Merv Griffin show? And we were watching one time, and they had something where they asked 4 people from the audience to come up. And Andy Kaufman was one of the 4 people who came up, but nobody knew who he was. And nobody knew that it was staged. And they did some magic trick or something like that. And then they told everybody to sit down, and Andy didn't sit down. And he told Merv Griffin that he wanted to sing a song. And they were like, everybody was dumbfounded. And so Merv said to the audience, well, do you want to hear him sing a song? And everybody's like, yeah, let him sing a song. And he was doing his foreign man, you know, that became kind of like Latka character. And he did the Mighty Mouse theme, which he became part of his act. And people were like, oh my, who is this guy? I can't believe he did this. And then it turned out the whole thing was a setup. So right from the beginning, Andy Kaufman was that guy who was a performance artist. And, you know, he wanted you to laugh sometimes, but not always. Sometimes it was really confrontational kind of thing. So a lot of people know him from Taxi, where he played Latka. And you can see in the documentary that when he played Latka, he was Latka. And you didn't talk to Andy. You talked to Latka. If you wanted to give him direction or something, you talked to Latka, which is very method, totally absorbed in his part, but of course can be really irritating if you're trying to do stage business or, you know, props or costumes or something like that. And that's really what they get into. The other thing is about the footage that's on here, which they talk about in the documentary. It was all shot by his friend Medved, who's kind of a co-writer with Andy and Andy's ex-girlfriend. And really, Jim Carrey just wanted them to shoot some stuff so he'd have some footage, really for personal use. And then they thought, oh, maybe we'll use it on like the DVD. And when the studio saw the footage, they said, no. As he says in the film, you look like an asshole. You know, this is not going to help the film. And they buried it. They, you know, embargoed it kind of thing. And it took like 20 years before they were able to use the footage. And then they decided to do this and shoot some new stuff with Jim talking about it. And that's how the film came to be. We'll talk a little bit about the director a little bit later on, but this is one of those movies where you say, oh, there's a director? Isn't it just some editor putting together a bunch of clips? But, you know, yeah, there's a director. You got to figure out how to put those clips together. And you may agree or disagree, as with any film director, about the way he put it together. Did he sequence it correctly? Do you like the fact that he had the interviews in there? Could they have been less of this or more of that? One of the questions that I asked, like 2 of them have things from reviews. If you wanted to look at the reviews, the one person wasn't particularly crazy with that aspect of the film. So that's a criticism we might take on the film. So I would say open it up at this point to anybody who just wants to give a sort of general reaction, not necessarily responding to the question, just the general reaction to the film. And especially if you've seen Man on the Moon and if that made a connection to you, or if you've only seen the documentary. So anybody want to open their mic and talk? Come on, that first person. You know, I taught middle school and high school for a long time, so I know how hard it is to raise your hand there. A lot of peer pressure here in the boxes. I don't hear anybody. I see people leaning forward. Maybe they're clicking.
I have some input.
Okay.
I'm willing.
Oh.
Okay.
Everybody's
All right.
jumping in.
Okay.
I just
All
want
right.
to say that I was never really a fan of Andy Kaufman, so this was a good introduction to me, and thank you for doing that for me.
I was a fan of Andy Kaufman, but he got him on my nerves. Same thing with Jim Carrey, though. So maybe he's the perfect person to play it. I like some Jim Carrey films, but Jim Carrey got on my nerves when he was crazy Jim Carrey, like in The Mask and Ace Ventura and stuff. I just thought he was in Dumb and Dumber. I just thought he was stupid. I didn't get it. So I have a kind of mixed thing, but you would say, well, then he's the perfect person to play Andy Kaufman because he's like that, and that's why you reacted to it.
Would you put this way?
Daryl is talking.
Actually, it's Jules.
Actually, it's Jules.
Oh, okay.
We never received the handout.
Oh,
Nothing. We came in
Okay.
cold. We were cold, but we'll listen in. But hopefully that can be remedied for the next session.
Did you see the documentary though?
No.
Oh,
No. Well, let me, Jules and Daryl, I'll talk with Katie. It might be in your spam folder. I heard at least one other person say that it went to their spam folder, but we'll make sure that you get that.
We checked.
Yeah, we checked it before.
Okay. Okay.
We also didn't get the link information today until 2 minutes ago.
Okay. All right. We'll make sure you get that more in advance for the next.
Thank you.
I had some input on the film.
mm-hmm.
What struck me most, I think, was to hear Jim Carrey, as he was interviewed, being coherent, like, quote unquote, a normal conversation, if you will, as opposed to all the zany actions I've seen him on film and on TV up to that point. So that, in a way, was kind of refreshing to me, just to hear his.
Yeah, you got to remember, Jim Carrey is, almost 20 years, past that film.
Right.
So he's a very different Jim Carrey, and his career was in a very different place at that point. His career kind of fizzled around like 2004, 2005, and I think that's part of it. I see Barbara raised her hand politely, so let's go to Barbara.
A teacher too, so I'm used to raising my hand.
There you go.
I approached the film as I wasn't going to like it because I never cared for Jim Carrey. Andy Kaufman, I remember little, not a lot about Andy Kaufman, but I'm looking at it from a different perspective, from a psychological perspective rather than the filmmaking perspective. And I was riveted to it. I couldn't stop watching it. For something that I was going to do the dishes while I was watching it, I just sat down, and very interesting, I think, psychological perspectives and the parallel between Jim Carrey's personality and that of Andy Kaufman.
Well, talk about the psychological aspect. People have written about the fact that Jim Carrey became possessed. He even says he became possessed by Andy Kaufman, which some people say, yeah, well, maybe, or maybe that's Jim being Andy Kaufman. It's another con job on his part. I think on the sheet, which I guess some people didn't see, one of the things that he says on there was that on the questions, he says this was less of an acting or impersonation than the result of possession. He says he attempted to communicate telepathically with Kaufman, and there's the whole thing about he looked out in the ocean and the dolphins were jumping, and he knew he was connected. They share the same birthday, day, not year, but the same birthday, and so he felt this kind of thing. The title of the film is The Great Beyond, because Andy's gone, but the original film, Man on the Moon, is named after a song by the group REM, Man on the Moon, which is about Andy Kaufman and other things. And The Great Beyond is a song by the band REM, which kind of talks a little bit about Andy Kaufman, but talks about that whole idea of connecting with something beyond us. And Jim Carrey gets a little spacey in some of the new interviews with him. He like sort of philosophical and things like that. And I know I watched it originally with a couple of friends, and some of them thought, it's total BS. He's saying that. He doesn't buy that stuff. He's doing this for the film kind of thing. So psychologically, I don't know if he was possessed or really doing an interesting job of acting.
And do we all do that sometimes?
Well, we're all acting.
Yeah.
Somebody said all the world's a stage. I forget who it was. He was a pretty famous guy, I think. But
I think it was a woman.
It was a woman?
Gertrude Stein.
Did she say that?
Well, actually,
Gertrude Stein.
it was Shakespeare, but some people say it was Bacon. But no, it's Shakespeare. It's Shakespeare. But Someone said that whenever you see that the quote is from anonymous, it most likely was a woman.
Okay.
All right. So either Tom was going to talk or Tom was laughing and he popped up. But who has a question?
I do.
Raising the hand is a good way to do it. There we go.
Yeah.
There's a physical hand up. Very good.
I'm not crazy about Jim Carrey, but I actually think he's a phenomenal actor, an absolutely phenomenal actor. I would hate to be in his brain. I think he probably, I know he suffers depression. He seems like ADHD, hyperactivity. Who knows? But I think he's phenomenal, and I the range of work that he's done and the way he approaches his work. I do find him exhausting and I find him irritating, but I also think like Robin Williams in a similar way. Robin Williams was also a genius and could do like hyperactivity in a second. So I don't know, I kind of put him in that category where I was just blown away by it. And I was really glad I got to see that documentary because I never would have gone out of my way to find it. That was my impression.
He did win a Golden Globe for the part, so it's not quite an Oscar, but he did get recognition for it, and people really like that. I think the Robin Williams connection is really good. When I saw the film originally, someone said to me, "I don't understand why you don't like Jim Carrey because you really like Robin Williams," and he's the same way. Like you see Robin Williams on a talk show, he can't turn it off. It would be very hard to interview Robin Williams, and I know directors had issues with Robin Williams because he wanted to improvise and everything and wouldn't follow the script. One of my favorite Robin Williams films, one of my favorite films is The World According to Garp. And they said, it was really hard. George Roy Hill directed that. And he said it was really hard to get Robin to turn it off and just focus on the part. And he said, Robin, this is your chance to show people that you can act. And he finally got him to turn it off. He said, but when the camera was off, and they were killing time while they set lights or something, they said he was Robin. He was always on. He also suffered from the depression and things like that too. So I don't know, that could be part of it. There's actually a new documentary out about the last film of Peter Sellers, which never got released. And the guy was talking about the fact that Peter Sellers was also the same thing, a depressive, hard to turn off. When he was in character, and he didn't want to talk to Peter Sellers anymore. Same kind of thing. He faked a heart attack on the set of his last film because he was tired of working that day. They put him in the hospital, and then he showed up with Princess Margaret out to dinner or something like that. So kind of kooky too. All right, 2 participants have raised hands. 3 participants raised hands. So Jill, do you want to click on them, or how do you want to take them? Whoever wants to.
I'll go.
All right.
I was interested in what the check that he wrote, the $10 million check. I just thought it was interesting. He's had some kind of confidence that somewhere down the road he'd be making a ton of money. So I just thought it was interesting.
Then it even sounds like a little psychological tool, like that some therapist would tell you, write yourself a letter and mail it, but don't open it up for 1 year, and let's see if in that letter everything happens. Comment here about Robin Williams was empathetic, but not so Kaufman or Carey. I think I might agree with that, but who else had their hand up?
I did.
Okay.
I just wanted to comment. I thought that he did an amazing impersonation of Tony Clifton. To me, that was phenomenal, how he transformed and was able to, I guess, duplicate what Andy did.
Yeah, and I think part of it was because even for Andy, it involved a lot of makeup and padding and things like that. So they were able to duplicate that. I think, I could probably dress up as Tony Clifton and fool somebody. I don't know if I could do the performance part, but I could certainly look like it. And we were chatting a little bit before this session started that you kind of see it in the documentary, and there's other things about it too, that although Andy appeared as Tony Clifton, sometimes on talk shows and things like Letterman, he also sent other people to appear as Tony Clifton. And the famous one is the one where he's invited to Hugh Hefner's Playboy Mansion, and it's not him. And
Yeah.
then in the middle of it all, he walks in as Jim Carrey, and people are like, what the, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Peter Sellers got a mention there, someone commented, and Jonathan Winters. Jonathan Winters, good friend of Robin Williams, and also manic with some psychological issues and things. So maybe this is something that happens with comics. Somebody else who had their hand up.
I did.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yep. Steve.
Steve, I thought in the end of the film, when he said that he really took on the persona of the character when Jim Carrey was talking, I thought that was really interesting. And it took me, I watched it in 2 days, and it wasn't until the second day that I realized that Tony Clifton was really Jim Carrey. It took me a while to figure it out.
So you actually bought it that Tony Clifton was another person?
I did it first, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's radically different, and he's also the most obnoxious of all the characters.
I mean, his lip is even out. Bottom lip is out. And
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Tony Clifton I couldn't handle. If Tony Clifton was going to appear on like Letterman or something, I wouldn't even watch. I found him completely obnoxious. I was talking to Jill earlier about the film, and the other person I brought up was, if you remember when Joaquin Phoenix went through this odd period where he decided he was going to be a rapper and he grew this mustache and beard and stuff, and people were like, what happened to him? He's such a good actor. What did he do? And, something must be wrong with him psychologically. And, it took a couple of years before people found out it was all a hoax. It was just the performance on his part. That's all. He was doing an Andy Kaufman. So, not that unusual. Anybody else on general comments?
I was just going to say that my grown son, introduced me to this Andy Kaufman, what's his name, Jim Carrey thing a few years ago. And since you brought it up, I had forgotten what I had learned. So now I'm confused because I watched the documentary and I watched Man on the Moon and I watched a million YouTubes on this.
Oh boy.
Because like Barbara, I found it so much more psychological than I found it to be acting. And so I tried to remain like really objective about the whole thing. And now all my films are mixed up in my head because I watched so many different things about both of them. But I found that Andy Kaufman was believable, and Jim Carrey, I have nothing against Jim Carrey. I'm not a big fan. I'm not a little fan. I mean, I'm neither. But I found that Jim Carrey, I felt like he was obnoxious. I felt like I didn't believe him. I felt like I didn't think he embodied him. I felt like he might have been a good actor impersonating him. But I remember when Rami Malek did Queen, what's his name, Freddie Mercury. I didn't know Freddie Mercury. All right, don't yell at me. I didn't know who Freddie Mercury was. I knew the music, but I didn't really identify with any of that. And I found Rami Malek, so I gravitated to it so much, I watched it 4 times. And I also watched a million Freddie Mercury documentaries, okay? But when I watched this and I went back, I felt like he really turned me off in every way, and that I felt like he was on his pedestal by saying he embodied him and he channeled him. And, maybe I think he just did a great job impersonating him, but I felt like maybe not so great a job because I felt like Carrey was a buffoon and I didn't feel like Andy was a buffoon. I felt like Andy seemed, and I don't know, he seemed like a gentle soul that had this craziness that he did.
Do you like Andy Kaufman better than Jim Carrey?
Yeah, I liked Andy Kaufman better.
Yeah.
I just kept feeling very sad because he died. I just kept thinking about that it was not fair. He was 35 years old. And,
I will say if I had been like the producer of Man on the Moon, I don't know if there is any other actor, though, that could have played the part. You might not love Jim Carrey as Jim Carrey or Jim Carrey in the part, but I don't know any other actor that actually could have played the part of Andy Kaufman. He seems, now in retrospect, he seems kind of perfect to play the role, even though I'm not a
I don't
big
disagree
fan.
with that. I don't disagree with that. I didn't think about who else could play him. I didn't go to that part of it. And I think he probably was the perfect person to play him. But there was something about Andy Kaufman that I felt he destroyed.
I think
it'd be interesting if you were a hardcore Andy Kaufman fan, what your reaction would be to even Man on the Moon. Like, you know, I don't even want to see somebody portray him. You want to see Andy, watch Andy. Why would you watch somebody copying Andy?
I think I'm the only one in the group that maybe hated this movie.
I'm sure you're not.
I have to start by saying my background is theater, and I was an actor for a number of decades, and so I come to it from that perspective. And I watched the documentary. I had to stop it a few times and scream. I discussed it with my husband, who totally got my aversion to the documentary. I don't even know if it's a documentary, actually.
That's a good question, too.
I don't view it as a documentary. I view it as a vehicle that Jim Carrey took, that he and his, Milos Forman, they put together this thing that they're calling a documentary. But I saw it as an opportunity, and kind of a sad opportunity, for Jim Carrey to use Andy Kaufman's legacy and sort of get off on his own. You know, I'm so effed up, and, you know, I can't separate me from, there's a line at one point that says, with regard to the wrestler, I don't think he was trying to kill me. It's just creativity. No, it's not creativity. It's actors forgetting that there is an understanding when you're acting that you're not going to hurt. You're portraying someone. You are the vessel to become that person. And on stage, it's your obligation to take care not to hurt them physically. And so then it kind of turned into a joke, and, well, is it Andy? Is it me? Is it whoever? No, it's you, or it's Andy, or it's someone else. And the way they sort of merged all it, it's the same reason I hate reality TV. It's how we got our president too, by the way. But anyway, I just think you have to make distinctions. And I really like Jim Carrey as a performer. This made me like him a little bit less. I really liked certain kinds of performance art, standalone performance art, and breaking the fourth wall is fine, but know when you're doing it. And I found this, I found that character, the lounge lizard guy, Clifton, I think it is, I could barely survive that voice.
Yeah,
And
no, I thought he was very difficult to watch.
very difficult to watch and listen to. I actually never
But I can't
saw.
blame Jim Carrey for that. That's an
No, I'm
Andy
not
Kaufman
blaming Jim
character,
Carrey.
and he's doing it.
I'm not blaming him for that, the development of that character or the existence of that character. What I am saying is, I think that in part it was Jim Carrey on a couch doing a therapy session in the body of Andy Kaufman, and I didn't really particularly appreciate it.
Did you see Man on the Moon?
It's funny because after I watched the documentary, I didn't have time because I did it late last night. I'm about a third of the way into Man on the Moon, and I'm very much liking it. And I think he's the perfect actor to portray him. I'm not arguing that.
Right.
This documentary.
You don't see a need for the documentary to
Absolutely
exist.
none.
Yeah.
Absolutely none.
So it does.
All right.
Yep.
Someone else? Just again, general comments?
Is Barbara, do you have a question? Your hand is up. Maybe unmute yourself. Oh, hold on. Sorry, you need to unmute yourself, Barbara. Sorry, you have to still unmute yourself. Okay. All right, we'll come back to you, Barbara, if you can unmute the volume.
She can also go to the top of the screen also, if not the
I
bottom.
think I got it.
Okay, good.
But in the meantime, I had typed my question, not question, I guess comments. Let me just get that. Okay, so I agree with the person who said, I'm sorry, I missed your name, with the person who said this is maybe not a documentary. I don't think it's a documentary. My brother, I'm very fortunate to have a brother who's an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker. And I don't think this was truly a documentary. And my question is, again, I go back to, because that's my background is education and psychology, who's Jim Carrey? Similarly, who was Robin Williams? Were each of them in their own way really afraid to discover who they were? And as you mentioned at the beginning, again, I know Jim Carrey has, really, we don't see Jim Carrey anymore. And as you said, he's taken up art, which is another form of expression. Maybe he's still trying to find himself. I don't know.
Well, let me jump to the question of whether it's a documentary. My take on it is it's absolutely a documentary.
Okay.
In fact, it follows most of what modern documentaries do, particularly in the age of Netflix, I would say, which is a lot of clips and a lot of stock footage that you use, packaged along with newer interviews that are done with people after the fact, looking back and sort of cutting back and forth between them. So it is a documentary. There was a note on the sheet, but for people who never got the sheet, the director is Chris Smith, and he's known for a documentary called American Movie, which is an interesting documentary. And he's worked a lot with Netflix, and the ones that he's done recently, which are available on Netflix, there's one called Fire, the Greatest Party That Never Happened, which is about a huge concert festival that was an absolute disaster. The Disappearance of Madeline McCann documentary series, and then Tiger King, which is the #1, or was the #1 last month, documentary on Netflix, which I have no interest in watching. And although everybody says like, oh my God, you got to watch it. The guy's crazy. This is the guy who owns the Tigers and all this kind of stuff. And that just doesn't appeal to me at all. So you could say, is it a documentary? Is it just a promotion of this wacko guy? Are we taking advantage of him? But it is a documentary. I mean, there's no question it's a documentary. Whether it was necessary to make this documentary is another question. And actually, our third film, there's a kind of comparison because there's a film and then there's a film about the making of the film. And you don't need to watch both, but watching both will give you a different experience. But we're going to watch the making of one. And in some cases, I think they're actually better than the film itself. I like Man on the Moon. I like the documentary. I don't know which one I like better, probably Man on the Moon a little bit. But I wasn't a giant fan of either one, but I think it's a very interesting film, that's for sure. I think we kind of covered the first question in our discussion, but again, for people who didn't get it, the question was, did Carrey take his acting performance to the ultimate level by immersing himself in the role to the point of suppressing Jim? Some people say this is like the ultimate, method actor kind of thing. It's like when Robert De Niro does a part and he gains 55 pounds and he changes his face and, he's willing to do all of this stuff. Is that the ultimate acting, or is the ultimate acting the guy who just walks in and does the part? He doesn't, doesn't need the fancy makeup and everything. I mean, we have some people who have some acting experience that they've talked about. And I don't think there's a definitive answer to the question, but we can certainly react to it. And somebody said the Jim Carrey who does the modern interviews in the documentary is a very different Jim Carrey. And yes, he is. He's 20 years along the way with a different career and things like that. And he seems more thoughtful. He certainly doesn't seem crazy at all. He comes off a little bit egotistical, which leads me to the second one, Is it the second? No, yeah, I guess it's the second question that we have on here. So let's talk about that. This documentary is not about Andy, which actually I had a friend watch this and he said, "Oh, I thought it was about Andy Kaufman." He said, "It's really about Jim Carrey." I said, "Oh no, it's definitely about Jim Carrey. I mean, you learn about Andy Kaufman, but the documentary is about Jim Carrey's performance as Andy Kaufman. Make no mistake about that. Since Carrey's the only interview subject in the film, which by that I mean we don't hear from people who were on the set, like Milos Forman or Paul Giamatti or Danny DeVito. Would you agree with this reviewer?" So the reviewer said, "Carrey is a forthcoming, interesting interview subject, surprisingly willing to share his own history and demons. The on-set footage of Carrey, Kaufman, and Carrey Clifton berating people is only interesting for so long and actually gets a little tiring before the film is half over. But Carrey, the interview subject, keeps the film going." So let's talk about that, the mixing of the two things to tell the story. I mean, the Jim Carrey interviews is about half of the documentary, I would say. Does that work? Is that a good technique? Did that help you? Did that make it better? Did that keep it moving? Or should there have been less of that and more of Andy and clips from Man on the Moon? Does anybody want to take that on, the structure of the film? And we're also talking about the director here then, so. Steve is motioning towards his camera, I think. Steve, were you going to say something?
I didn't like the interview so much, but I loved the footage of him impersonating Andy Kaufman, and I loved the footage of Clifton, Tony Clifton. I thought that was incredible. And the actual interviews I thought were a little boring.
The Jim Carrey interviews.
Yeah, stroking his beard and stuff.
I mean, one thing the director could have done is the Jim Carrey interviews could have just been voiceover other footage, and you would have seen more footage of Andy or Man on the Moon or things like that. That was one way to do it. Now, I have a feeling Carrey had a lot of control over the making of this documentary because he basically owned all the footage. So, again, if you want to say it was an ego trip on his part, he wanted himself on the screen doing that talking. So that could be part of it. It didn't have to be structured that way, but that was the way it went.
Yeah. Thanks.
Anyone else on the structure?
I think it was a good idea to have Jim Carrey actually during right now being able to talk and for us to see him, because I think that he's matured and he's very calm and quite different from 20 years ago. And it's a pleasant surprise to me to find that he had matured and grown up so nice.
What about the fact that, you know, they tell you quite clearly, Jim says it almost proudly, that they didn't want the footage to be shown because it made him look like an asshole. So is it brave that he was willing to show that side of himself? Or was it he was trying to show that he wasn't that person and like why he did it all? Was he trying to justify his performance? Because some of you obviously were irritated by Jim Carrey in the film, so maybe he did come off as that person that the studio didn't want to show.
I think he was just trying to show that he has grown up finally and matured, and he's quite different from what he used to be. And it's a pleasant surprise to me. He looks really good.
Okay.
Can I talk? All right. Well, I think I'm coming from an actress perspective too. We're forgetting that it's show business, and he happened to do these roles really well, and he kind of got typecasted, it looks to me, in these types of roles, just like Robin Williams, but he has a wider arc of what he can do. He can do, much more than Robert did, just the comedy, just that more than, oh my God, who are we talking about did. But even like Will Ferrell, he does those same types of roles all the time. That's how they make their livelihood. They're getting typecasted as those roles. If you saw him in other things like that Penguin movie or like Jim Carrey in that movie and some other Liar Liar. He's not as whacked out as he is, but you never really see him in a more serious one where you may see Robert Williams, like Will Ferrell. You never see him in anything else but that one type of character. So he's able to transform as an actor into those really big, crazy characters. So, and he's making a living at it.
Well, I think Jim did get typecast in the Dumb and Dumber, Mask, Ace Ventura kind of thing for a while. And Cable Guy was another one. I'm just looking at his filmography here. But then you have The Truman Show, which is a really interesting film, which they show some clips of on there. And then Man on the Moon, which he's manic, but he's manic because he's playing Andy Kaufman. And then the oddball ones like How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which I hate because I like the original one. But some of my favorites of his are Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind with Kate Winslet, which is a really interesting film. And I'm looking back here. I mean, he did Anchorman too. There was a film he did. Well, he had a little bit part in Peggy Sue Got Married, Francis Ford Coppola's film, which that's a great B movie. Oh, there's a film called The Majestic. I don't know if anybody ever saw The Majestic.
Oh, yeah.
If you hate Jim Carrey, I would say take a look at The Majestic, which did not do really well, but it's a real movie fan movie. It's about a guy who wants to keep an old theater going back in the day and keep showing the great films of the time.
I saw that. Well, I think, as you say, he was doing a method acting, he's going to do it 24 hours a day till he's finished with it. And he kind of just used that technique again in what I saw of the documentary. I didn't see the whole documentary, and I saw the movie a long time ago. But I think we're judging him, we're trying to psychoanalyze him when he's an actor. I mean, one of my acting coaches always teaches transformational acting, Sandy Shorin. He transforms into these characters, and he's just kind of really staying and transformed and it may be to make a business, to sell the documentary. We don't know that. I mean, we could like it or not like it, but that was the choice he made.
Well, the question that we were asking about, the way the documentary is put together in the interviews, the one thing I would agree with that interview, if you get a chance to read it, it's on the Roger Ebert site, but it's not Roger Ebert who did the review. The one thing I would definitely agree with is I would have liked to have had interviews with other people. I would like to have heard Milos Forman comment. I would like to have heard Paul Giamatti. I would like to have heard other people other than just Jim Carrey commenting on it. I thought that's what made it seem so egotistical, like this is Jim, just making himself into something here. So I think that
maybe there'll be a second documentary with those people.
I don't think so.
I'd like to see the makeup lady interviewed, because she obviously had some strong feelings about the whole thing. Some of those people really got involved.
I mean, I really like Milos Forman as a director. My favorite Czech director, yay, Czech. My favorite Czech director, and you only see little bits of him, and you can see he's super frustrated, but what can he do? So he goes along with it. But I got to think there's more to that story than the little clips you see of him talking about directing. I mean, there were times when I think he probably wondered, why did I make this film? Why am I doing this? This is a giant mistake. So I would have liked to have heard from him. All right, let's take a look at the third question here, which is, and they talk about this, when does a joke go too far? Did Jim Carrey take the joke or his performance too far? And again, I'll read some of this for people who didn't get the sheet. Audiences are likely to find Jim irritating, as some people on and off set found Andy. On the set of Man on the Moon, we see Danny DeVito, Paul Giamatti watching Jim's chaotic acting, looking bewildered, questioning if being in the film was a mistake. Milos Forman sees begrudgingly. Even in the new interviews, Carrey sometimes comes off as pretentious and narcissistic. Is that the real Jim, or is he still playing some of Andy? Is there still a little Andy, even in those interviews kind of thing? Like the whole thing is a joke. One of the reviewers said something about, Jim Carrey says something and then you see that little smile on his face like, wait a minute, is he serious with what he's taking him? So did he take the joke too far? And we can also talk about Andy. You may not like Andy's humor. Did he take the joke too far? And I'm going to give you two quick anecdotes about Andy Kaufman's performance. One of his most famous ones, and you can see some of it on YouTube, is the Carnegie Hall show. He did a show, Carnegie Hall, huge show, full house, supposedly a great show as far as the entertainment and the acts and everything. He wasn't, his silly, stupid self. He did a lot of things. And at the end, he says, I love you guys. You're a great audience. I wish I could just go out and have milk and cookies with all of you. In fact, let's do that. Outside, there are some buses. Get on the bus, and we're going to go out for milk and cookies. He had 23 buses he rented. Everybody in the audience was invited to go on the bus. They drove to a place that had been set up with milk and cookies, and he mingled amongst the crowd and talked to people about the performance and things. He's like, wait a minute, where does the performance end here? It didn't end when the show was over. It goes on. It just continues for him. That, for him it was all. And the other thing that's I think interesting is when Andy Kaufman died, he died of lung cancer, but it was known that he was a health food nut and a non-smoker. When he smoked, as Tony Clifton, they were fake cigarettes and things like that. And people said, he's not dead. It's another Andy Kaufman bit. Don't you get it? He's not dead. Watch, in like 6 months, he's going to resurrect himself or something. People thought, this is Andy Kaufman. He's not dead. And of course, he was dead. But the fact that people thought it was possible that this was another shtick that Andy Kaufman was doing tells you how much they bought into this whole over the top, take the joke to the ultimate degree. Now, if I had bought tickets for his show, at another show that he did at Carnegie Hall, where he ended up reading The Great Gatsby out loud and wouldn't do anything else, and people just walked out on him, I would have wanted my $60 back on that one kind of thing. But again, confrontation. So did he take the joke too far? What do you think? Maybe Jim took it too far too.
Could I say something?
Absolutely.
Okay. I hated the movie. And so I'm going to go, right out there and just say I hated it. But why? I love to watch movies. And so, one, I never was a huge Andy Kaufman fan, but I didn't hate him. I just wasn't a huge fan. I thought he got a little strange toward the end. Same thing with Jim Carrey. I've seen some of his movies. He's okay. I think he's a very good actor. I felt this movie couldn't have been more pretentious, or the documentary couldn't have been more pretentious if it tried. And I felt manipulated throughout the movie, manipulated, as if they're in on the joke and the viewer isn't. And I don't care for that kind of style. I just don't. I don't like to be played in real life by people, and I don't like to be played in a movie, some sort of media type of thing. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing, by the time the movie was an hour in, I was already on my phone. And my husband knows this. Once I get on the phone, he knows I'm done. I paid attention, but there's a real high level of manipulation in this documentary. And it's really there. I don't know why it's there. And I don't think Jim Carrey has changed one iota in 20 years. He just plays it better now. So that's my take. I understand I might be in the minority because it seems like most people adored this movie.
I don't know, adored. People liked it. I wouldn't say I adored the film. I don't hate it, but I don't adore it. But I'll pick up on just that one word, manipulation. Manipulation is an important part of documentary filmmaking. Many documentaries are put together in such a way to make you believe something, a point of view. They're not all objective, and a lot of times they manipulate you, and they sometimes do it through film things, through editing, and that sort of thing. And so I think if you told Jim Carrey, I think you were very manipulative in this documentary, he might say, well, thank you.
He might. I bet he would. I bet he would. But I felt toyed with.
Yeah.
And that's
well, if you said to Jim Carrey, I think you manipulated me and tried to make me believe that you were someone that you're not, he probably wouldn't like that. But that could be true, that he wanted you to believe he was someone else. So.
Well, maybe. I kind of have a different take. It's a little more self-serving on his part.
Oh, yeah.
The manipulation. And I agree. Everything in life is a manipulation. I understand that. But this felt, it felt, I don't like a movie to presume I'm an idiot, right? And this movie, I think, or this documentary, somehow I don't think respected its audience very much.
Can you give an example of something you thought did that, though? What was something in the film that made you feel that?
It must have been cumulative in the fact that I was thinking about it. My husband and I love to watch movies, and we have like fairly divergent tastes, but we're open to each other's tastes. So we like talk on this and then we chew on it. And like 3 days later, how did you feel about it? Because sometimes, you know, as you digest something, your viewpoint changes. So it was more of a cumulative thing. As the movie went on, I was getting more and more annoyed, and I couldn't figure out why I was getting annoyed. And after a couple of days, we watched it over the weekend, I don't know, Saturday maybe. I just think throughout the movie, I started unconsciously starting to feel played with in a way that I didn't like. And then over the last couple of days, it coalesced more into, hey, I think you think I'm stupider than, you know, than I like to be viewed as.
Well, I think there's an interesting phenomena in watching streaming movies or watching movies on a streaming service, which is a friend of mine that I told to watch this film, and I said, you know, watch the film so I can ask you some questions and see your thing. He said, it took me 4 shots to get through it. I kept stopping it because it was getting on my nerves. He said, in the end, I kind of liked it, but I couldn't watch it all the way through. It was just, you know, I couldn't handle Andy. I couldn't handle Jim Carrey and everything. Now, of course, in a theater, you would never do that. You could get up and walk out, or you could sit there and grin and bear it kind of thing. But there is the thing of watching things at home and streaming. Of course, it was true for DVDs and VHS tapes and things like that, that you could watch it in installments, which is not the way it was made to be viewed, but you could do that. And I think that kind of affects people too. Now, you said you had your phone out and things like that. So
well, I pulled it out after, once I reached a certain saturation point, I was.
Yeah. But I mean, that's telling that, you know, like if you were in the theater, would you have said, I'm going to get popcorn now? You know,
possibly. I have done that in theater. I actually did that. I actually walked out of The Lobster midway. I said to my husband, have fun, see you later. And I went out in the lobby and I just amused myself for the second half. So yeah, I might have left.
I proudly hold up that I've never walked out on a film, no matter how bad it was. I suffer through the film. I don't know why. It's like this thing that I can't walk out on the film kind of thing. But here's a little caveat. The films that I choose for the series here and the one at Montclair Film are not always films I love. They're films that I think are interesting to watch and that will generate conversation. Okay, so if you said, is this one of your favorite documentaries, Ken? No, I think it's an interesting documentary. I'd recommend it to people. You know, if you like Andy Kaufman or you like Jim Carrey, or if you're just curious about it. But no, I wouldn't say it was my favorite documentary. It actually won a couple of awards at some smaller festivals, but that's neither here nor there, you know, with your reaction to it. But I'm looking at the time here. We're coming down close to it. There were a couple of people that asked about, could we find out about the films or watch the films earlier? Maybe Jill's going to chime in here, but the premise was that on Friday, people would get information. They watch the film on the weekend, so it was fresh in their mind. On a Monday, we would do it. You know, when we do it in the theater, the film just went off 3 minutes ago, and we started our conversation. So it's fresh in minds. And I think that was just the whole idea. If Montclair Film or Mill wants to change that, that's okay. But, you know, we said we would talk about what next week's film is, and it's very different. But if anybody has any final thoughts on Jim and Andy, we'll do that first. So
I just want to say that I've never taken one of these film discussion courses before, and I thought it was a great way to begin because, I mean, it made me think a lot. I wouldn't say, I mean, I watch a lot of documentaries. I love them. And I wouldn't say this was on my top 10 list, but I didn't dislike it because I found it so interesting. But I had to pursue more information about Andy Kaufman before I could completely understand what was going on. But I look at how many people are happy and not happy here. I mean, I think it enraged some people. And and opened a lot of opinions up. So I think that it was a good choice, Ken.
Well, when we started the Cinnamon Conversation series at Montclair Film, one of the things we said was we would try to choose films, and I'm not always the one who gets to choose the films, but we would try to choose films that if you went out with a couple of your friends and saw this film, after you left, you'd go for coffee or drinks or something, and you'd keep talking about the movie. If you just walked out and you said, yeah, it was okay, not great, it was okay, and that's the end of it, that's not a film we want to have a discussion about. So ones that provoke or charm, either way, I like charm is great, but, for everyone that people have said, oh, that was a tremendous film, I love that film, there's going to be somebody who hates it. I taught film in high school and I've taught it in college, and for every person who says that this is my favorite film, there's someone out there who this is the worst film ever made for them. It's just true. I would use Citizen Kane as an example. Never introduce Citizen Kane to a group of students by saying, a lot of people say this is the greatest film ever made, because you set it up so that they're going to find everything they can possibly find wrong with it. You can set it up and say, this film was considered very important for a lot of the technological things that it did. Okay, that's something to look at. Let's look at the filmmaking. But if you say it's the best film, you're in trouble. So the way you set it up is a big deal. Hopefully everybody will get the intro for the next film, but I'll give you a little preview of it. Very, very different film. It's actually my favorite of the three films, and it's probably the sweetest of the three films. It's a film called Harold and Lillian, A Hollywood Love Story.
Oh.
And it's about two people, husband and wife, who worked real behind the scenes in the movies. They didn't even get a credit on the screen for what they did. Harold was a storyboard artist, eventually became an art director, but he was a storyboard artist. Some people say, I don't even know what a storyboard is, which is kind of exactly the point of it. I think you'll be amazed at what he contributed to films that you know very well, like Hitchcock's The Birds or The Graduate or something like that, but he got no credit whatsoever for. And his wife Lillian was a film researcher. So she was the person people would go to, a director and writers would go to and say, what kind of sets would we need for this? What would the costumes be? What would the accents be? What cars would be used at that time and everything? And it's a really nice film, and it also gets into some other personal aspects of their lives and stuff that I think is really interesting. So that's Harold and Lillian, and it is also on Netflix. So if you want to watch it early. I know a couple of you said you kind of did research here. You looked at YouTube and stuff, which is great. Those are my favorite students. You're going to get extra credit for that. You know that. But the other thing is, if you watch the film early and you have some thoughts based on the questions that I'll send out in the handout, jot some things down so it's in your mind. Because I don't know about you, but I can have a thought and 5 minutes later I have no idea. What were you going to say? I don't even remember what I was going to say. So I need my notes. I always have my notes with me. So that's the film that we're going to do for next week, Harold and Lillian. And if you've seen it already, that's fine. But you might want to watch it again. It's really easy to tolerate that film. The first and third film are the two more difficult ones, and then this one is in the middle. I also wanted to have a film that at least had one woman working behind the scenes kind of thing, because you certainly didn't see much in the Jim Carrey film about women involved in film. In fact, a couple of the women that were in Man on the Moon don't even show up on there, from the Taxi group and things like that, and The Girlfriend. So that's an interesting point on that film.
They did a lot of interviews. They did a lot of interviews with the people from the Taxi cast that worked, but not with Jim Carrey. They worked with Andy Kaufman, and they did separate interviews on YouTube with
on YouTube,
Judd, and with Judd Hirsch and I can't remember their names right now, but they did a lot of those.
Well, that was, like I said, one of my criticisms about the guy who put it together, director, because I know there's a lot more footage. There was 100 hours of footage that they used to make this documentary. So there's a lot of stuff we did not see. And I wonder about some of the choices. I would like to have heard Judd Hirsch, Milos Forman, all those people. I could have almost done without the Jim Carrey stuff, maybe some voiceovers, like I said. I would have liked to have seen the other stuff. So now I feel like there's a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor that I wish we had seen. we're never going to see.
Ken,
I don't think.
Ken, if we're sitting here debating whether the film is actually a documentary or a faux documentary, isn't that basically the point? I mean, wasn't that basically the spirit of the type of humor that Andy Kaufman had? In the same vein, the idea that it annoys us or upsets us or gets us a little bit like rustled up by it, I mean, that was the whole idea behind Tony Clifton. That was the whole notion.
Absolutely.
So if the movie is basically true to the spirit of what Kaufman was doing. So it shouldn't be a surprise.
No, in fact, one of the reviewers said this is a meta film because, you know, it's like layer upon layer kind of thing. You know, you're annoyed with Andy, but then you're annoyed with Jim, who's playing Andy, who's trying to annoy you about his performance. And it's like, is the whole thing a joke? I mean, it's possible if Jim Carrey was super, super honest, I wouldn't be shocked if he said, the whole documentary was a joke. Don't you get it? It was a joke. You know,
it's a Joaquin
I
Phoenix
wasn't being serious. It's possible. It's possible. I mean, it is a documentary. I'll say that again. It is a documentary. Whether it's a documentary about what you think it's about or it's got another objective, that's another question.
Or is it a film that tells the story of a documentary?
Well, I haven't seen a documentary about the making of a documentary, which would be an interesting thing to do. The behind-the-scenes documentary. There are plenty of making of movies. You could do that as a whole, film festival of making of movies. And I find making of movies very interesting. I really like seeing behind the scenes. And that's another thing. Somebody said, should I watch Man on the Moon first or should I watch the documentary first? And I'm not sure which way to go. But I would say, like, when you go to the movies, new movie comes out, would you like to read the reviews and read about the film before you go into the theater? My wife doesn't want to know anything about the movie. She doesn't want to know anything. Okay, and I want to know everything. So, for example, on Apple TV just came out this movie, Greyhound, with Tom Hanks, World War II Navy movie, which I thought was really good. But I wanted to read about it because my father was in the Navy. I knew he went through some of these things. And I said, I want to know how authentic is this? What's it based on? And it's based on a novel. Is the novel based on an actual historical event? I want to know all this stuff. She doesn't want to know any of that stuff. She just wants to see the movie. So for me, I would watch the documentary first. And then I'd watch Man on the Moon. But for some people, they say, well, you spoiled Man on the Moon. What's the point of watching Man on the Moon now that I've seen the documentary? So that's an individual take. And that's going to be true of our third film, too. There's another film we could watch.
I don't know if this is like fair or whatever it is to ask, but for those people who
Somebody's got their mic open, but they're talking on the phone or something.
So for those people who knew Andy Kaufman, was he always in a joke? Or like I saw one YouTube where he had his parents come on, I don't know if it's Johnny Carson or David Letterman, I forget. But he had his parents come on and introduced Mommy and Daddy. He called them Mommy and Daddy. Mommy, I love you. And she goes, I love you too, Andy. And I went, well, is this him or is all of it just a perpetuation of this character that he created that was known to the public as Andy Kaufman? And maybe somewhere in the recesses of when you can't see him, you find the real Andy Kaufman, which you can never see because you're never going to go into his apartment and know what he's like as the real Andy Kaufman. I mean, and I did think that the documentary could have been a perpetuation of the joke. This is the joke about the documentary, which is, it's like 3 layers in the documentary. It's Jim Carrey being Andy Kaufman, who's being Andy Kaufman. I mean, it's just, it's like those Russian dolls. It keeps going on and on.
Well, Andy Kaufman would be very happy with your comment. Because, for example, how do you know that was actually Andy's real parents?
Only because I've seen them a few times, but you're right. I don't really.
It could be actors he hires to play Andy Kaufman's parents. I mean, and the fact that you would say, like, well, I think it really is his parents. But, I guess it's possible, knowing Andy, that's what he wanted. That you weren't really sure about is he performing? Is this really him? From what I have heard and read, Andy Kaufman, the person off screen with his friends, was a really sweet, nice guy. And no, he did not do the, faces and impressions and everything. He was actually quite shy and things like that. And I've heard that that's true of Robin Williams too. It's just once that camera gets pointed in your face, you become another person, you know?
I have to say, I'm not so sure Andy Kaufman would like this documentary if he were walking the earth right now. Because when I look at the arc of this documentary, all I see is Jim Carrey's take on Andy Kaufman. And if you go frame by frame by frame, I saw the physical reaction, the body language on the part of Paul Giamatti, on the part of, what's his face? Danny DeVito. There was like absolute, let's cut the bullshit body language going. And they never gave voice to that. They never got anybody else's point of view. It was all Jim Carrey. And I don't, it would have been a much more powerful documentary if it came at the subject from all different angles, and it did not.
Well, that's what I said. That's, I think, a flaw, that the young people aren't interviewed. But again, it was Jim Carrey putting together a documentary about what it was like to be playing Andy Kaufman. So he gets to call the shots as producer and things like that. So that's what it was. Actually, I think it would be really interesting if Andy Kaufman was alive when they made the documentary. I could see Andy coming in, punching out.
Absolutely.
Punching him out and everything, and then it turns out later he actually liked it.
It's a joke. Exactly.
That was all a show too.
Right.
And
that's all a shtick.
Yeah, and that's Andy's thing. The joke never really ends. It just continues and continues. I mean, some of the things he says when he's like the wrestling guy about women and stuff, oh my God. I mean, in this day and age particularly, I mean, to say these things, how did he not lose his job in entertainment? But people say, well, it's Andy. He's acting. Is he acting? I don't know. Is he really acting? The line is very, very gray on the Andy Kaufman, Jim Carrey version of Andy Kaufman.
Yep.
So,
he did eventually lose his job on Saturday Night Live. That there was a vote because what's his name? Lauren Michaels. I'm back in Lauren.
Worked on SNL.
Lauren Michaels did a spoofy. We don't want Andy Kaufman on the show anymore. We're going to take an audience vote as to who wants him on and who doesn't want him on. And apparently the audience voted, and the whole thing was supposed to be a joke. But then Lauren Michaels didn't put him back on the show, and Andy Kaufman was supposedly very devastated by it.
Keyword is supposedly.
Supposedly.
Andy might have said, I want off the show. But rather than just fire me or I quit, let's do this shtick. And people will think, oh my God, the audience actually got to vote him off the show. I can't believe it. The joke never ends. That's the thing with Andy. So we are over our time. But if there's any final questions or comments, pass them on.
I told you ahead of time that I did meet Jim Carrey when I was sitting in the makeup chair at Letterman, because I was doing a sketch there that night that he was also appearing on. And he came into the makeup room. He was very normal. He was very nice. He wasn't crazy. So I'm not a big fan of his comedy either, but I think he's an actor and he's doing his job.
Yeah. Well, I saw Raymond put another comment that he's still very confused about all of this stuff. So, Raymond, I think you will like the second film because it's a lot more straightforward, and it's interesting in its own way, and it's another kind of thing. So, I don't know if Jill's still on, if she's still hosting.
I'm still here.
All right.
Yeah, no, I mean, the only thing, we'll send out the sheet with Ken's questions and discussion thoughts probably next Friday. But if you want to watch the movie before then, that's great. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us or reach out to us through Katie. I'll follow up with her and make sure that we can, make sure everybody gets the handout in advance. And we'll meet back here next Monday.
Great job.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for coming.
Take
See
care.
you in the movies.
Stay well, everybody.